Hi, I'm Andrew Mack. Welcome to Loblolly Press in Conversation. Today we're talking to Candice M. Kelsey. She's a writer whose work is sharp, thoughtful, and deeply engaged with the world around her. Originally from Cincinnati, she spent nearly 3 decades in Los Angeles and now splits her time between LA and Augusta, Georgia. She's the author of multiple poetry collections, chapbooks, and a parenting guide, with work recognized by the Iowa Review, Cutthroat Magazine, and Writer's Digest, among others. She's been nominated for 10 Pushcart Prizes and 2 Best of the Net Awards, and we were honored to publish her poem, I See Trees, in Understory, our relief scene for Western North Carolina, which was also nominated for a Pushcart Prize. Beyond her own writing, Candice is a poetry reader for the Los Angeles Review, a dedicated mentor to emerging writers, and an advocate for literary communities, especially among incarcerated populations. She's also a longtime opera fan, a Murder, She Wrote enthusiast, and a dedicated Dodgers supporter. We're starting today's conversation with birds, because where else would we? Specifically with Jackie and Shadow, 2 bald eagles nesting in Big Bear Valley. Candice and I have been watching their live stream, waiting for their eggs to pip. No updates yet, but there's something fascinating about seeing life unfold like this in real time. Candice's poetry works the same way, capturing moments as they happen, finding depth in the everyday. She's a writer who pays attention, and that's what makes her work stand out. Welcome, Candice.
Jackie and Shadow are 2 bald eagles in California in Big Bear, and they have a live feed. They've been mentioned in the news. Perhaps you've heard about them, but their last 2 clutches of eggs haven't hatched. So this year they've just laid 3 more, and so we have about till the 1st of March to see if they pip, if they hatch. And so I'm really hoping for that to happen. It's a live feed, and so I have it on in the background all the time, and I'm just sort of watching these beautiful 2 bald eagles at the top of this tree. And they're on my mind, and I share it in my classroom with my students, and most of them are minorly annoyed, but some of them are really into it. But I just love watching kind of nature, in the without knowing that they're being watched, I guess, but seeing the beauty of just how fragile everything is, but also how tough they are. And I think it also was hitting around the time of, I had recently lost my dad, and, the political climate was gearing up. And I think it was just such a joyful, wonderful bit of nature, untouched kind of by man, even though there's a camera up there. And then all these people watching and commenting and cheering them on, to see that it didn't come to fruition was a little sad. But, hope springs eternal. So we're going to do another cycle.
Yeah. Do you consider yourself a bit of a bird watcher, or is that something you do in your normal life, or is this like specifically about these eagles?
I am an animal lover, but I'm not one of these really smart people who can name all the birds and who can, like, I have a poem about Jimmy Carter who could name apparently every bird in Georgia, which blows me away. I would love to be that kind of person. I just enjoy all different animals. I could definitely get into bird watching if I weren't so busy. But yeah, I mean, I just have an affinity for creatures.
Yeah, you are so busy. And actually, one thing I wanted to ask you about is, you've spoken on other podcasts that you've been on, and because it seems to come up in your work too, like the various roles you play as just as a human being. And I was wondering if you could just give people a sense of, like, what are those roles? Who are you in the world, and what do you do?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's nothing that interesting, and we all play different roles and wear a million hats, right? I'm a mom of 3, and I am a teacher and educator going into my 27th year of teaching high school English, which I love. And about 8 years ago or 9 years ago, I started to actually write poetry. I had a sort of a personal traumatic incident happen, and somehow it just triggered what I think was the writer within me for a long time, having been an English major and whatever. I was always reading poetry or writing about literature, but I never actually tried to write myself. And this incident kind of jarred me into that. And I haven't looked back since. So it hasn't stopped.
Yeah.
I thought, oh, well, this is just going to be like a temporary like trauma response. It just kept going, and I'm so happy about it. And I've just been working on trying to hone my craft since then.
So you use writing as a way to get through that event in
Yeah,
your
I
life, and
did.
then it just kind of stuck as a thing that you did.
Absolutely. I mean, the stuff I wrote was horrific. I look back at it sometimes. It's just basically like rambling emotions of like in a journal. But from that, it gave me this, it renewed my, um, not renewed, but I think sparked this love of language that I have in a new way. Instead of just appreciating like Joan Didion or appreciating Zora Neale Hurston and sharing that with my students, or writing, papers in grad school. Now it was, oh, I could look at language this way and actually use it myself to explore certain things. And that to me was just a wonderful gift that came out of a dark time. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, those are really my key roles: educator, mom. Um, other than just I tutor, I help kids with college essays. I'm an auntie. I'm very proud of being an auntie, and yeah.
Yeah, so many cool. I mean, I think that I want to touch base on kind of that experience of first. Actually, let me rephrase that question. What I'm curious about is with that first experience of writing
Mm-hmm.
and feeling really bad at it and getting started. It's like I have a really distinct memory of sitting at my college dorm room desk, and I had finished reading one of my favorite Southern writers, Larry Brown. I'd read his first novel, and I was trying to write like him. I was trying to write stories and create this kind of world that he created. And then suddenly I found myself writing about my childhood in a way that was like just kind of streaming out of me and getting that stuff out on the page. And it was all really bad, of course. And in that moment, I was like, oh, I'm writing poetry. I thought that I wanted to be a prose writer, and I found myself being a poet. And I've heard you speak on this before about like you've tried all these different genres. So that first experience of writing, when did you realize it was poetry for you? And also, you've tried a bunch of other things, so why do you keep coming back to poetry?
It's such a great question. I've been thinking about it a lot lately because I'm looking at trying to take some, craft courses this summer. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, do I want to branch out to fiction, which terrifies me and I have probably zero skill at? Or do I want to stick with what I love, which is poetry? Or do I want to keep doing some more nonfiction, creative nonfiction? I think at the end of the day, I'm game for anything that uses language to navigate the human experience. But I do keep coming back to poetry. I think that the crystallized moments are very appealing to me. There is a sense of preserving something that is fleeting. I think that's a lot of where the motherhood in me comes out, because, like being a mother, I'm aware of the fragility of time and the fleeting nature of it and not being able to hold on to things, and that writing a poem is like a small gesture. You know, it's a small gesture. It's something that um it's something that comes from an accumulation of experiences, but also of time and kind of steeping in my mind. And
No, I think it really does capture that it is the evolution of an idea over the course of however long you spend writing it, that you have distilled to this little nugget of information, and you pass it to someone else and you say like, do you understand
yes,
what truth I found in this? I always find that when I'm editing other writers, if I get, a first draft of a poem, that should be the first thing that we're looking for, is like, is this is there any universal aspect to this poem? Does it reach someone other than myself? And if it does that for like one other person, to me, sometimes that's good enough. You've captured this thing. So yeah, I think that that's exactly what poetry should do. And wonder if you are sometimes gathering material that doesn't go anywhere. Is there a time when you're like, I've got all this material about a thing, but it's just not turning into like what I want? Like the truth is just not there, and I can't find it. And
Oh, 100%. I mean, my notes app on my phone is, I was just looking at it today, so filled with all these little fragments and these little broken tiles of ideas and thoughts and things that I either A, have not had time to go back and revisit, or just haven't quite germinated yet. And then I've gone back many times to 5, 6, 7 years ago and looked at pieces I wrote that were so incomplete, but yet I knew there was something. I just couldn't figure out what was there. And now that I've had more experience reading other amazing poets and taking courses and really thinking about it, I can go back, and I've had a couple that I went back and totally reshaped, but still that kernel of what I wanted was there. I just didn't know how to release it, I guess, or to get it to where I want it to be. And so, yeah, I think that's very appealing, and it's manageable. And I think for whatever stage of life, this chaos is, like, poetry for me seems manageable. I think also as an educator, when I try to inspire my students to be open to language and the power of words, and to not be so intimidated or bored with reading, I'm not going to throw Moby Dick at them. I'm going to say, hey, let's look at a Lucy poem, right? We can all relate to, celebrating the self, in this short little snippet of what I can give you. And so I feel like it's such an accessible genre in so many ways, which is, I always am confused when people say, oh, I don't want to understand poetry. That to me is puzzling, because it's small enough, it's accessible enough. It can be difficult, but you're not working with 600 pages. Like, you have a small room, like, enter the room, feel around, and yeah, I don't know.
I think people think it's more cryptic than it is often.
Right, I agree.
I also think poetry doesn't always provide the answer. I think that a lot of folks are really interested in the TV show or the novel that wraps it all up, and those actually do really serve a purpose, right? Like, that feeling of something being complete feels really good when you're watching it and you're reading it. And sometimes I think this speaks to the role of poets, but we're folks who ask the questions and don't always have the answers. I think
right.
What?
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Totally agree. There is such a comfort in that, and such a freedom too in that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It allows you to kind of explore. You're allowed to explore. It's a playground.
Oh my gosh, yes, playground. And that, but another kind of shade of that also is the linguistic playground, because it's also just sometimes about the language. And how great is that? I mean, like, just the elasticity of it and the potential of language, and how language is both familiar and yet new and foreign all at the same time. And like, that really, to me, is what draws me to poetry too.
Yeah. Can we talk about your role as an educator? I as a person who worked with youth for the first few years of my career, I am always curious. I never worked with youth in the kind of educational space or in the poetry space. And I just feel like often our high schoolers have the pulse on what's going on right now. And they seem to me like would be the best people to be writing poetry. They have access to all of this like information that's coming at them. And
well,
how are you finding that
in the same way? I mean, in many ways,
it hasn't changed 27 years of being in education. How are kids
if I can just generalize, there tends to be an intimidation
as opposed
around
to
writing
when
or
you
around
started.
an English class, right? My reading skills aren't where they need to be. I've been told this by my parents, or I can't write because my papers come back with red marks on the commas. And like, so there's just, if you're worth your salt as a teacher, you have to get students past that, right? And you have to get them to understand that language is about self-expression, and reading is about having an ongoing conversation with the author, a dialogue with the author that's real and authentic. Anyways, that's how I approach teaching. I don't want to get into all that, but I think that students are still hungry to express themselves in a way that they're proud of. I was teaching the morning of September 11th, and our school chose to have us keep the kids all day and not send them home. So I had to meet with all my students on that horrific day. I was in Los Angeles at the time, so it was, later. So everything had already kind of was happening or had happened. And so I had them all write about, this is momentous. Let's write about what you're feeling and experiencing right now, no matter what. And I kept it. So I have this beautiful bound document of 120 kids on the morning of 9/11 writing about what they were feeling. And now those kids today are in their 30s, and I've sent them all screenshots of what they wrote that day. And it's so meaningful to them. It's not that what they wrote was well written or, could be but like for them to have their voices that day preserved in some way, not published, but like preserved in some way. I think it I don't mean so much to them in so many ways, but today, for example, some of my students were writing, I showed them, oh gosh, what poem did I show them? Oh, Red Wheelbarrow. So I wanted them to write about a thing, right? An object. And one girl wrote about her Invisalign. And I'm like, she's like, that's so embarrassing. It's so embarrassing. I was like, no, like that's real. That's a real experience you're having. And the way she wrote about it was fantastic, like in the whole same vein of like, so much depends on my Invisalign, So I thought that was brilliant. And one girl wrote about her like slick back, middle part bun that she works hours and hours on. And she wrote that in the same way that Ross Gay kind of wrote the poem where he tosses the child up in the air to the trees. I don't know if you know that poem. It's called Tossing a Child or Throwing a Child. And so it was all about her repeatedly putting the gel in her hair. And I mean, I'm just so inspired by these students. So I truly believe that students love to authenticate their experiences through writing. They just have to have that entry point, that allowance, that like permission.
The permission to play, right? Like they have to be given that by someone.
And for someone to not say, oh, you're writing about your Invisalign? No, you need to write about a rose. Like, no, like you have to tell them like that's the real stuff of life,
The idea of writing about something that and understand is not not a new idea at all. However, when folks do it and they're doing it about something of the moment for them, it absolutely immediately becomes interesting. And I'm thinking a little bit about how you were saying already when we're reading, we're having a conversation, but when we're writing and you give them a poem like Red Wheelbarrow, and now they're having a conversation with that poem because they're writing their own version of it.
Right.
I just think it's a really beautiful.
So beautiful.
Way to get
it's such
into it. Mm-hmm.
Totally. And for me personally, I grew up a very lonely child, and I do struggle with loneliness, and I know many people do, especially today. And for me, that connecting, is so powerful. So, being in a poem, reading Seamus Heaney or, reading Terrence Hayes, like I can connect with that person in a way that really it's an antidote to, this existential loneliness that we're kind of all feeling. I don't know.
In a world where technology connects us, mm-hmm. and yet we feel more disconnected than ever, how does that kind of mental health crisis going on, that experience of disconnection, go up in your work with youth and then also in your work as a writer?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's also interconnected. So the work that I've done on myself, just mental health work and therapy and really trying to get those negative voices out of my head, is definitely evident in my writing. I sometimes I address it head on. I think I see the world less and less through the lens of, therapeutic work, which is good because I've made so much progress. But I think there are just certain things that, that I have had to battle with that have made me a much more sensitive writer and more sensitive mother, I hope, and teacher. Because a lot of these things become stuck points as a teenager. So I'm working with teenagers, and so I know and I remember what it's like to be a teenager, and I remember the negative voices that were coming my way from wherever at that age. And so I would like to think I'm more empathetic. I'm a safe space for my students, as well as my own children. So that's the other reason why I think teaching literature and representing and presenting to my students characters that are broken and fragile and experience life from, wildly different perspectives and backgrounds than my students do is all part of me just one giant act of trying to build empathy. I just want to build, if there's one thing my students walk away with, is a renewed sense of empathy or a deepened sense of empathy. And of course, writing skills and reading skills. But I mean, that's really what my aim is, because I think that obviously that is something that is so needed today. And I think that that also paves the way for conversations about mental health and the discussions, for people to be real and to be able to say, you know what, I need help, or you know what, I'm not doing so well. And if you don't trust that the authority figures in your life are welcome, or what would welcome that sort of authenticity for you to be open about your mental health, then I think we have a serious problem. And we're seeing that in society where, there have to be those safe spaces where you feel like the people who are corralling you in whatever part of your day are in tune with their own health and able to extend that to you as well. So in my poems where I do address things like eating disorders or, growing up with a mother with mental illness or struggles in a marriage, these types of things, I do address them or sexual assault. Because I'm hoping there's somebody out there who also has experienced that and is like, this poem makes me feel connected. It makes me feel less alone, and maybe encourages me too to think about and work through some of these things. Yeah. Sorry, I don't mean to launch into preaching, but hopefully I answered the question.
Yeah, it's great. I am kind of blown away by feeling like what you're speaking to is poetry as like a function in society. There's kind of the artistic aspect where we just appreciate and love the art, and it can just be beautiful, and that's okay. And there's also a function where poetry for the writer is doing something for them, and it's doing something for the people who are reading it. And so while not all of your poems are about mental health or disability or any of those other things that you've experienced, the ones that are you can actually see you working through those things, that distillation process. And then when someone else reads that, I think it's one of the most important things in the world to feel seen. And sometimes reading a poem makes you feel seen, and I think about that as I'm working on my, I've been working on a new collection for 6 years now. And as I'm thinking about kind of how I've changed and how it's going to go out in the world, I think it's really important in this particular moment to be very visible as a queer man in the South, as I have depression, I work on my depression and my anxiety, and all of these things, I don't think they have to be the exact center of all of my poems, but when it gets out into the world, those people who are like, I don't know anybody else in my life who's gay. I literally don't know anyone else. I hope that they can access my book and be like, oh, it's okay to be who I am.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's what your work is doing too. It's saying, this is who I am, and I want you to know that I'm here in the same way that you're like a teacher and you're there for them. And yeah, I just think it's activism, but without being called an activist in a way.
Correct.
So
yeah, I love that. And I'm very excited to read your work, especially that it spans so many years. There's going to be such a great multiple arcs going on in there.
Yeah,
but yeah,
I haven't been writing the whole time. It just I had the idea about 6 years ago, and I've been building on it since then. And I just don't put any pressure on myself to complete the product. I just like the ride of it. I think to speak to your point earlier about kind of that gathering process of writing down your ideas and your notes app on your phone. It's like my notes app on my phone is a complete mess because it's just full of things that I've had random thoughts about for the last 6 years. But those things I do go back to them and I'm like, I forgot that I had that thought, but now I'm ready to write the poem about it.
Exactly. Yep. 100%. It's a beautiful thing.
What are some of like the biggest myths about poetry that you want to blow the whistle on right now?
Can you make any money? Like, what kind of money can you make in poetry? Why are you doing something that makes no money? Right. And it's not that I want to blow that myth, because I have no idea what kind of money other poets make or don't make or whatever. But it's not, obviously, and preaching to the choir, but it's not about making money, at all. It's about all these things we've been talking about, making beauty and taking violence and pain and injustice and using words as a balm to create something, not a bomb, but a balm, like a soothing thing to create something beautiful and connect with others. And again, like you said, be seen and say that I exist. And, so that thing about the whole doesn't make money, it's not productive, it's not part of, what is it? How it's so anti-capitalist. It's not this, in many ways, it's the most anti-capitalist, anti-fascist thing you can do. And so I'm here for it. Uh,
Yeah, I'm really this idea about money is such an important thing. I think people should. I think poets' art should be valued. It should be valued at the same level as a Van Gogh painting. Like it takes the amount of time, it takes the effort that it would take to make those things. But at the same time, the gift of poetry in some ways is that it is accessible.
I think it's confusing to some teenagers. Like, why are you not monetizing this content of yours? you know? I think the other myth would be that poetry can be too personal. So I had an experience where a poet friend of mine wanted to read one of my manuscripts that I was having trouble kind of getting out there, and I was stuck with it. And his response to me was, wow, your stuff is way too personal. I could never share this kind of stuff. And I had to really sit with that. It took me a long time to work through that comment, and no shade towards him. I get it. And I do think, yeah, it can be, I do have some poems that are super personal. I'm super inspired by Linda Pastan and Sharon Olds and, you know, Anne Carson and, these people who just write about all things. But I really came to the conclusion that I think there is an element of readers not wanting to read about the female body or about the queer experience or anything that might make mainstream uncomfortable. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Or like,
absolutely.
traditional tropes that are like, these are things we write about and these are things we don't write about. Like, screw that, like I'm reading Ocean Vuong and I'm like, okay, I can write about anything. I mean, I'm not going to write as quickly as him, but like what? Too personal? I don't get it. I mean, it's me. I'm writing. It's me. So I have to write me. You know what I'm
It
saying?
has to be a reflection of who you are. No, I totally get that. I do think some writers distance themselves far from it, but I still see that it's still a product of that person who created it.
It affected me, and I noticed that in my next batch of like months of poems or whatever, I noticed that I was playing it so safe. And I was really pulling back. So I think subconsciously it affected me. And so then I decided I don't like what I'm producing. So I started to use strict form poems so that I had the safety of the structure of the form. So I would write pantoums and sestinas and villanelles and some French form. And I found that it was giving me the opportunity within that structure to take more risks. And then I broke out of that. And now I'm just as wild as hell. I'm just a wild ass poet right now. I'm writing the craziest stuff I've ever written.
Do you feel like when you're doing that, are you getting the stuff out that you want to get out, and then are you refining it in some sort of process later?
It's so hard. It's so different with every poem. Every poem is a different process. But for sure, there's the most common way for me is the thing I notice or the thing I grasp or it's usually not an image. It's usually a concept, a thought, an observation, a question of wondering something, or being amazed by something that sits with me, and it just percolates, and I think about it a lot. And then I know when it's time to start writing it down, and I'll just write it all out, and it just flows beautifully at first, and I just feel so good about everything I'm getting out. And then I have to really be careful not to edit as I'm writing. That's one of the pitfalls I have fallen in, that I've had to struggle with in the past, and I'm really have broken free of stopping and revising as I go, because that just halts the process. And I want to allow the wild thought, the wild associations, the imagination. I think that my imagination is one of my strengths, and I feel like I've edited that imagination for various reasons for far too long, and I'm committed to just that's what I mean by being wild. I just want that imagination free of all of that. And so I just get it all out there. And then I'll look at it later in the evening, or I'll look at it in a couple days, or I'll look at it in a couple weeks, whenever I kind of feel the desire of, I know where I need to go. I know what I need to fix with that. And I'll go back to it anywhere from 5 to 5,000 times. Yeah.
You've mentioned a lot of writers that you have been reading or that you enjoy reading and have been a part of your life. Like, who are you reading right now?
Okay, so I'm currently reading Morgan Parker. I don't know if you've heard of Other People's Comfort Keeps Me Up at Night. I just got that. I'm a huge library goer, so I always have, my library holds list. And I just read Han Kang, who won the Nobel Prize recently. And she's phenomenal, especially Greek lessons, because it's basically like reading poetry. I mean, it's basically just this hybrid prose poem, beautiful writing. And then I'm doing Ocean Vuong's memoir, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, which is beautiful and horrifying and so impactful. I feel like it should be required reading for every American student.
Let's talk about your work. I'd like to just get into that side of things now. So one of your poems from your most recent chapbook, Postcards from the Masthead, is an erasure poem, and it is an erasure of Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, and I'm thinking it's maybe just one page from the book. Do you have that in front of you that you could read?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
I do.
I'd love for you to read it, and then we'll talk about it.
An erasure of Annie Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek for Exxon Mobil Corporation, Shell PLC, Chevron Corporation, BP PLC, and Marathon Petroleum Corporation. The giant creature, grasping, hooked inward, seizes a victim and paralyzes it with poisons that dissolve fresh water, being sucked by a giant unrecognizable catch of carnivorous bloody bites, stuffing their wide jaws so full of dragonflies, ants, their prey, they swarm over featherless birds and eat bite by bite.
Almost feel like we don't need to debrief that poem. I think it's so concise and speaks almost entirely by itself. And I guess one question I have is, with an erasure poem, maybe speak to kind of how that came about for you, and also how it puts you in the conversation with Annie Dillard.
Sure. Well, she's one of my favorite writers. And on my bucket list to visit Virginia's Tinker Creek. But I teach Pilgrim at Tinker Creek because I think it's such an important book, especially in this time period. And this scene where the giant water bug, she sees a deflated frog that has had its innards sucked out by this giant water bug, is such a small little snippet of what's happening in, the world of bugs and critters, right? In this creek. But also so huge of a moment, right? And she's horrified and disgusted, but also kind of taken by it, and that's how I feel toward what big oil is doing. Like I can't look away. I'm horrified. I'm taken by how this is allowed. It's something I just can't wrap my brain around, and that startles me every time. And to learn that we're our country is now recommitted to fossil fuels, it's just something I can't process. And so I feel like, unfortunately, so much of the Earth's beauty and its gifts for us are being erased by the human imprint. And so I thought an erasure poem was the way to go, and to show that this giant water bug was like big oil in what they do to the earth, and extracting these fossil fuels like the water bug liquefies the innards of the frog. And what can Dillard do but just write about it?
Yes. I was I think it's such a testament to so for folks who are wondering kind of how an erasure poem works, it really is taking what's on the page and removing anything extraneous, leaving behind, and what you leave behind becomes the poem. It can happen in different ways. This one in particular is more like a blackout poem where the words left behind are literally in white, and the poems on the words covered up are in black.
And I wanted them to be black. I did the blackout on purpose so it looked like oil.
Yeah, it does look like oil, and I think this is where I think it's the best example of a way of doing an erasure poem where you've taken the source material, which has impact. Just by you could just read that in the context of big oil, which you've placed it in, and it would be meaningful. And you've layered on top of it now a poem, and also the metaphor really of what you have removed. What they have removed and extracted from us, you have removed and extracted from the page and left behind essentially oil slick. I think it's just a really incredible thing, and I'm so excited it's in the world as part of your chapbook. I also noticed that I heard you say in a previous interview that Moby Dick is one of your favorite books, and
It is.
you love it. Yeah, I love Moby Dick as well.
You do too? Okay, I was gonna say I admit it because I've taken some heat for it, but like, I don't know, come at me. I'm ready to tell you like why, but you love it too, so you get it.
I think that you have to think about it as the first. It's the proto novel. It is the thing that kicked off what we read today in America as like the American novel. So I think even if you don't like it, quote unquote, you have to accept that it is part of our literary history, right? But I noticed that, so, obviously we have this idea of the masthead being a part of a ship, and even the cover of the chapbook, which is it a drawing or is it?
I gotta tell you, so the artist, this artist Matt Kish, Kish, one of my favorite artists, and I got to know him because he went to my university, Miami University in Ohio. But he wrote a book where he took every page of his edition of Moby Dick and did a found drawing of every single page inspired. It's phenomenal, and I use it in my classes. Anyways, I reached out to him because he had this beautiful picture. So he did some work on this one, but it's very inspired by his picture, and he said he would be happy to do it. So this is his artwork, and so he's a Moby Dick artist.
Yeah,
and among other. He does Heart of Darkness. He's fantastic.
We'll include the picture of it so folks can see it. But I was thinking about how this idea of like navigation comes up through that, like being on a ship and navigating through what is essentially like an unnavigatable landscape. There are no landmarks. You wrote down, or you used as an epigraph to the, I think, the final section or the next to last section of the collection. It's not down on any map. True places never are, which is from Moby Dick and is Herman Melville. Can you just speak to that about how did that inspire your writing in this particular section? And yeah, how does it speak to what you're writing right now?
Oh, definitely. So, well, this description, I believe, is of Queequeg's Island, the harpooner Queequeg, how, in his chapter biographical, which tells all about his leaving his royal stature in his make-believe island, right, to go off and learn Christendom with the whalers, and then he feels completely soiled by that and unable to return home because he's been ruined by Christianity. I mean, the humor in Moby Dick is fantastic, and the criticism. But that's the true, that's not down on any map, his island, Kokovo, I believe. But, true place is never. So I'm very much about exploring place, geography, belonging. That to me is a huge, important theme. And the novel of, Ishmael really is that. He's this literary orphan who's finding a place to belong on a ship that's off for 3 years, doing all sorts of crazy, bloody things. But it does inform my work currently too, because I recently, 4 years ago, I grew up in Ohio, but I moved from Los Angeles to Augusta, Georgia, with my family. And that was a huge move, cross country, and a little bit of culture shock. And my daughter goes to school in the South. And so I was familiar with the South. I spent a lot of time in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which I love. And so I had to get to know Augusta and that culture. So that exploration of the true place of me and my identity and where I belong has been in my mind and in my, creative juices for about 3 or 4 years now, and trying to figure that out. And I have a new collection coming out in December, and it really does speak to the parts of me that identify as Midwestern, or identify as West Coast, or identify now as Southern, and what that means for me. So it's been a really cool thing to explore, and feeling like, that there really is no, like, maps do kind of lie. I mean, maps are really so invented in so many ways. Yeah. Yeah, they're just, I don't know, they're just man-made. I was asked to pick up another course this year to teach, because we had a teacher that left, and it's a global history class. And I'm teaching about the Chinese dynasties and the Qin dynasty, and we're looking at the Great Wall, and I'm just, all sorts of ideas are coming to my head to write about. But this concept of place and geography, and how invented it can be, but also how much impact it can have on you, and how it can shape your identity in positive and also negative ways, and how to challenge that, and how to really find the true places in your heart without sounding too cliche.
Yeah, well, when you moved across the country, what happened to your writing?
I noticed that I fixated on the things that were tough to adjust to, things that were foreign to me, that I didn't understand, that I needed to work at understanding, challenged me to open my mind. For somebody who says, oh, I'm open-minded, taking pride in that, as soon as you say that, you realize you're not. So I had to really become a lot more open-minded, and understand a new culture and a new outlook on life, and understand a new history, and how that creates, how that affects how people create relationships. So I really struggled with making relationships, and that was generative for me in terms of as a writer. So a lot of my poems, that right after that move, I came out with 2 full-length collections. So I think it inspired a lot of writing, and a lot of struggling with things that I didn't understand. And again, I think that comes back to my curiosity. So you put me in a situation where I feel like an outsider, and there are many things I don't understand, but it's not that I don't want to understand them. It's I want to understand them. So I'm going to really do the hard work to do that. And so I think that's what happened
I can't help but think of the kind of feeling of isolation that, being on that ship would cause, or like in that connection back to Moby Dick. And I know I've moved many places in my life, and it wasn't until I moved back to Asheville several years ago, or I moved to Asheville several years ago, that I finally felt like I had found a place where I belonged and it fit. I noticed it sounds like we're a little different in the sense that it seems like when you are experiencing kind of that restlessness of the soul, that you tend to find it very generative, and it creates more art for you. And for me, I think that I have come into a place now where I finally have felt like I belonged, and it has created such a generative space where I'm able to write really freely again, where I'm able to, I mean, I got married this last year. Like I found my partner, and thank you. And I have, founded the press in the last 2 years, and those things have been very generative for me. But I love that it's kind of just different for both of us. And I still feel like we both made our way toward belonging.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in our own ways. Um, I wanted to talk about another poem from your chapbook, An Albatross's Brown Eye. And if it's okay with you, I was thinking maybe I could read this one. An Albatross's Brown Eye, after Mark Doty's A Green Crab's Shell. Not exactly brown, closer to sunburnt, sweetness, raw confection, or something offered before a Japanese tea ceremony, boiled and gently rolled. Me, I will never know what its secret, snow-browed days are like, though accidental observation reveals a delicate ceremony of bone, some sipping strategy of right pinion to left glide, a crowned clockwise pantomime of power. Somewhere a child paints a bird's face, displaying one eye size of a saucer in contemplation, pure pupils constricted. Pinprick chaos of us, feather hunters and flush, this tea-bowl eye, made with wedding guest glaze, imagine seeing the world from out the warm ship of his green bill's fine clay. What ceremony is friendship, the transporting of delicate things, your great-grandmother's tea set in the afterhold? Not so reckless, we would sail if we could be welcomed into this, and know the kindest dusk eyes of a friend. Likewise, define harmony. Luck. I just am so impressed is the wrong word. I think when I read it, I love a callback to another poem. And I think it's so generative sometimes to be able to write the poem from a place of, I've already have the format. Another poet gave me the format, but I'm going to write about my experience. It's almost like writing a sonnet. You know that 100 million sonnets have been written. Um, and I think this idea of using a green crab shell as kind of your mold allows you to not worry about the function or the form of the poem. Only worry about what you want to say. In this case, as a person who is a bird person and loves birds, an albatross. Um, that's not a question, but that's to say that I think that what you've got is like an intricate layer of metaphor, imagery, synesthesia. You've got cultural references, all through the eyes of this bird, right? So tell us about the genesis of this poem and where it comes from. And then I have one more question for you after that, but I'm going to stop there and let you. I just want to hear where it came from first.
Sure. Well, I'm a huge fan of Mark Doty's A Green Crab's Shell. I mean, I think it's one of the most sensational, beautiful, just fabulous poems, and I just admire what he does in that so much. And in putting this collection together, I also was thinking about, in terms of sea poems or poems inspired by the ocean. I was thinking of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and I have reference to the wedding guest's glazed eye, right, from that poem from Coleridge, and then also the albatross. And so I thought the albatross's eye. I mean, this is, to me, the eyes of a bird. To me, I love birds too. Probably not to the extent you do. I need to learn more about them, but like when I'm watching the two eagles and Big Bear, like when they get a close up of one of their eyes, I just can't look away. I love the eyes of birds, and so it just sucked me in. But the real story is a dear, dear friend of mine. She was celebrating her 70th birthday, and her daughters were reaching out for, friends to say something nice, to give to her. So I decided to write her a poem, and that's what inspired me to write this. And the point of the point of genesis of it was, she had told me in my younger years, when she noticed I was driving recklessly when I was maybe 19. I'd known her for a long, long time. she had said to me, you need to, since you don't clearly care about yourself and you're driving like this, right? She just said it like it was. She said, you need to drive around as if you had your grandmother's most precious heirloom tea set in the trunk. And that's how you need to drive around if you're not valuable enough to yourself. And it just hit me so hard, and it changed how I drive, thank God. But it also just, it was just such, like you were talking about maybe not having an elder really influence. I'm the same. I never really had a grandparent in my life. And that came to me in that way of like this older, wiser person cutting to the chase and just looking out for me and loving me and caring for me in a way that I could understand. So when I mention the ceremony of friendship, of transporting delicate things, I'm thinking of her friendship and all friendship as a delicate thing. And to be able to see the world through that delicate friendship like an albatross's eye. I mean, what luck it is, what a harmony, what a beautiful, kind dusk it is to have a good friend. And so really it's about her told through this kind of looking at a piece of a creature like a crab shell or an albatross's eye. And then, a lot of it is also like the Japanese tea ceremony, and I'm thinking of the tea, the tea set that she mentioned.
What a beautiful gift to then pass down that experience you had with an elder of yours into a poetic format. I mean, you can really tell that you teach poetry because the references are falling out of your, like pen as you're writing. They're just completely falling out in the best way. I think this would be a poem you could put in front of someone and you could ask them to write a paper on where does this poem come from, not even knowing you as a writer. And I think you would find all of these little nuggets. Everybody would find a different little thing. It's like a scavenger hunt of poetry.
I appreciate that. I really tried to work on the sound elements. And I think that that's one thing in my poetry that is lacking is I'm not there yet skill-wise to really give those sound elements. And I feel like in this poem, I kind of achieved that. That was my goal, and I feel happy with it.
Yeah, you did. I'm thinking of also your reference to your elders, and I've found that I have a few elders in my life, but a lot of the elders' wisdom has come from some of our older poets. And last month we lost a really incredible poet, Michael Longley from Northern Ireland, and he has this really incredible quote, and I want to read that to you, and I kind of want to get your thoughts on this. But he says that one of the duties of the writer, the poet, is to use words with precision. I think what poetry does is it uses words at their most precise and their most suggestive. And one word out of place and the poem's dead. It's shocking, but that's true. And our poets, are custodians of the language. That sounds very grandiose, but I do believe it.
Oh, that's really powerful.
Poets as custodians of the language, that we really carry it forward. And I think of the poem we just read and how much it plays with sound, as you were talking about, and language and reference. And essentially we're getting like a history lesson of English, in that moment. What does that idea that poets are custodians of the language mean for you as someone who has lived in so many different places and represents so many different regions? How do you make sure that you're telling that story accurately and that you're carrying forward that language as the custodian of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's when you put it like that, that's a heavy, that's a big responsibility. Yeah, and I do think that that's one of the beautiful elements in the art of poetry is acknowledging that responsibility with language. And I think that poets get it. Poets know that language is valuable and indispensable and precious. So to be careless with language, I think is maybe, the blasphemy of poetry. It would be, a horrible thing to do, to be careless with language. And I think that all poets attempt to be careful with language. It is a heavy responsibility. I grew up as a child overseas in Hong Kong, and I went to an international school, and so language um, and the blending of cultures and language was always kind of part of my childhood. So I think that it made me quite aware of, just seeing the characters, the Chinese characters on buildings or on schools or on streets, and then learning, basic counting and things like that in Cantonese and Mandarin, ignited that for me. But I think I saw the artistry as a young kid of painting of Chinese letters, and that to me has always meant something of like, yes, letters are artistic. They are paintings in and of themselves. They have shapes, they have histories, they interact. It's a periodic table. I mean, the alphabet is a periodic table. They interact with each other and combust or do whatever chemicals do. But so just like you have to be careful with chemicals, like you have to be careful with your words and how you use them. And I don't know who said it, but a poet, one of the poets that I'm sure we both love, said something like, I can't remember, but if there's a word that doesn't belong or is extraneous in a line, something to the effect of it kills the whole poem. Like it's a problem. I attended a craft lecture by Dorianne Locks. I love her. And she, in her book, Finger Exercises for Poets, here's a chapter on the discreteness of the line and how every line has to be discrete and in and of itself should be a self-contained thing. And that blew my mind because I don't think that I was thinking like that. And when I go back and revisit some poems that maybe needed some trimming, or I wasn't as precise, or I wasn't really a vigilant gatekeeper with my language in that poem, when I think of it in that way of keeping each line discrete, and seeing if I can read the poem from the last line to the first and what happens then and how it could be tightened or how tightening can make it more expansive, that's very powerful to me. So yeah, I think we're shaping things with words, and so we have to be careful gatekeepers of the language. And also, that's our gold. That's what we spin, like that's the value. It's the, a poet is nothing without the words.
Thanks for listening to Loblolly Press in Conversation with Candice M. Kelsey. She has a full-length collection coming out in December of 2025 called Another Place Altogether. It's about endings, some beginnings, and geography and place, and about living bi-coastal as a poet. Loblolly Press in Conversation is produced, edited, and mastered by me, Andrew Mack, from my home in Asheville, North Carolina. Loblolly Press is dedicated to amplifying emerging voices from the American South with a focus on queer, BIPOC, and rural writers. To learn more about our books, writers, and upcoming projects, visit loblollypress.com and subscribe to our newsletter over on Substack. You can also follow us on Instagram at loblolly_press for updates, behind-the-scenes content, and more. If you did enjoy the episode, please do consider leaving us a review or sharing it with a friend. It helps us reach more listeners and support the writers we love. Next month, on April 3rd, we're releasing a new book, Distant Relations by Cheryl Whitehead. So if you placed your pre-order, we'll be shipping that out, and we'd love for you to go place an order on our website and support our poets. Thanks for listening.